Kate Van Doore, welcome. Now, you'll be giving evidence later today. What will your focus be?
My focus will be on orphanage tourism and how Australia is contributing to founding, funding and volunteering in orphanages in developing nations, and particularly on how children in those orphanages are often being trafficked for the purpose of profit. So they're being taken from their biological families under fraudulent circumstances and taken into orphanages just so we can volunteer with them, essentially.
So there's no way well-meaning Australians should be volunteering in any Asian or European orphanages?
The research shows, Joe, that no, we shouldn't be volunteering in orphanages and nor should we be funding them. That's not to say we shouldn't be funding vulnerable children overseas. Of course, we should be looking at how we can help out in that way. But funding orphanages inevitably leads to bad outcomes for children. We know that from our experience in Australia. We don't have orphanages anymore, and we need to apply that knowledge in overseas contexts.
So explain for us in a bit more detail what happens, or can you give us an example of a child who's been actually taken from the family or sold by a family to an orphanage?
Of course. So in the Nepal context, what often happens is recruiters move through villages where families often don't have a high level of literacy. Education is offered as a golden opportunity to these families, and families will really jump at it, and they'll often sell land and their houses in order to pay the recruiters to take their children to what they think is a boarding school. Now, once the children disappear with the recruiters, the families often go searching for them in the city to visit them at boarding school, only to discover that the boarding school never existed. The children have fake documentation produced, and that they become what we term paper orphans, because they're orphans by virtue of their fake documentation only. And then those children are entered into orphanages as orphans, and people come and volunteer with them. We fund them internationally, we sponsor children in orphanages, and none of this is good because the child is then kept from their biological family and raised in an institutional setting, which does not provide a good outcome.
Yeah, it just sounds like a horrible nightmare for those families. What happens to those children when they become too old to be of value to those institutions?
So often the children are just exited with no plan for their future. We know from the research that children growing up in institutional care, no matter how good an orphanage might be, 1 in 3 will experience homelessness, 1 in 5 will gain a criminal record, and 1 in 10 will commit suicide. And that is regardless of how good the institutional setting is. So whether they've been trafficked into an orphanage that's exploiting them and keeping them poorly in order to get more donations, or even if they're in a good orphanage that's providing an excellent education, those outcomes are the same.
Do you know if many of those children are able to find their way home, or are their pasts hidden from them and they just can't find their families?
So organisations like Forget Me Not are working to track and trace the families of these children in Nepal and Uganda. There's other excellent organisations that are Australian-based and doing that work as well. And whilst they're children, it can be quite hard because they have this fake documentation. So the tracing officers really have to work very hard to get as much information from the children as possible, and then to be able to track the families, often into very remote areas in these countries.
Are the countries concerned clamping down on this at all? Have you been working with those governments?
Indeed. So in Nepal, they are now prosecuting for trafficking into orphanages. Haiti is also looking to do the same. You can't volunteer in these countries without volunteer visas, but many people fly under the radar and just volunteer once they get in country. So it's very difficult for some of these nations to clamp down on the practice, but they're doing the best they can. Are there any orphanages that are doing the right thing? Like I said, Joe, it's very hard because according to the research, there is no such thing as a good orphanage, because the outcomes for institutional care for children are the same, regardless of whether it was a good or poor orphanage. So we don't talk about good orphanages. What we talk about is family-based care and getting those children back where they belong. And if they can't be with their biological family, in a family model, like a foster care family. So if there are well-meaning Australians heading overseas and they want to lend a hand somehow, if they shouldn't go into orphanages as far as you're concerned, how can they help? So please don't volunteer in orphanages is our first message. And if you're funding an orphanage, please consider how that funding is taking place and ask some serious questions of the organisation that you're funding. And if you are heading overseas, spend your money as a tourist. Rather than treating children as tourist attractions, go and see the cultural aspects of the country and spend your money that way. That's the way we can help these nations.
OK, Kate Van Doore, thanks for talking to us this morning from Brisbane.